December 2008. Amidst the bitter frost of a harsh British winter, staff stood shivering in desolate, out-of-town retail parks, unbolting the giant, familiar blue and white letters from their cavernous warehouses. Inside, the showrooms were dark. The tills were silent. There would be no last-minute Christmas rush, and certainly no festive miracle for the thousands of workers facing redundancy. The doors were locked for the final time. From the undisputed king of British flat-pack furniture to a hollowed-out shell, the fall was staggering. At its peak, Mullard Furniture Industries, known simply as MFI, was a true titan of the retail park. It dictated the weekend habits of the nation, boasting a valuation in the billions and an astonishing presence in 1/3 of all British kitchens. It was the destination for young couples buying their first wardrobes and families queuing on a Saturday afternoon. Yet, in its dying days, the entire retail operation of this once great empire was unceremoniously sold off to a private equity firm for a single, solitary pound coin. How did the very pioneers who brought the flat-pack revolution to Britain find themselves so comprehensively rejected by the market they helped create? The answer lies far beyond the arrival of a certain Swedish rival with its flat-pack bookcases and in-store meatball cafes. The collapse of MFI was a self-inflicted wound, a masterclass in catastrophic IT failures, a reputation battered by missing screws and faulty hinges, and the fatal arrogance of a brand that took the British public for granted. This is the tragic, frustrating, and ultimate demise of MFI. The Britain of the early 1960s was a nation in a profound state of transition. The grey austerity and strict rationing of the post-war years were finally beginning to lift, replaced by a tentative but rapidly growing consumer optimism. A new generation of young couples was moving into newly built suburban homes, eager to leave behind the heavy, dark, and often inherited furniture of their parents' era. They wanted modernity. They wanted clean lines, fresh designs, and homes that felt uniquely theirs. But there was a significant, often insurmountable barrier. Traditional furniture was prohibitively expensive. Buying a new wardrobe, a matching dining set, or a complete kitchen suite often required months of rigorous saving, followed by weeks, sometimes months, of waiting for delivery from high-street department stores. For the average British working-class family, furnishing a home from scratch was a daunting, almost impossible financial burden. You bought furniture once in a lifetime, and you expected it to last forever because you simply couldn't afford to replace it. It was within this landscape of pent-up aspiration and limited options that two entrepreneurs saw an unprecedented opportunity. In 1964, Noel Lister and Donald Searle decided to completely bypass the traditional, expensive furniture showrooms. They founded a modest mail-order business, initially naming it Mullard Furniture Industries, cleverly adopting the maiden name of Searle's wife to give the fledgling enterprise a sense of established, industrial weight. Their premise was astonishingly simple, yet radically disruptive. What if, instead of selling fully assembled, cumbersome pieces of furniture, they sold the raw components in a box, leaving the final construction to the customer? Today, the concept of flat-pack furniture is so deeply ingrained in our global consumer habits that we barely give it a second thought. But in 1960s, Britain, it was nothing short of a retail revolution. Lister and Searle understood a fundamental truth about the British public. They were inherently resourceful. The post-war generation was accustomed to making do and mending. They possessed a strong, practical, do-it-yourself ethos. If putting in an hour or two of manual labor with a screwdriver and a hammer meant they could afford a brand new chest of drawers for a fraction of the high street price, the British public would gladly roll up their sleeves. MFI began by placing small, unassuming advertisements in national newspapers and weekend color supplements. They offered basic, highly practical items, simple storage units, unpretentious beds, and functional wardrobes. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Letters and postal orders flooded into their small office space. Customers were drawn not just to the rock-bottom prices, but to the sheer accessibility of the process. You didn't need to feel intimidated by the hushed, thickly carpeted showrooms of premium department stores, where smartly dressed shop assistants might cast a judgmental eye over your budget. With MFI, you simply filled out a paper form, sent off your check, and waited for the postman to deliver a heavy, flat cardboard box. This was the quiet democratization of interior design. Suddenly, the ability to furnish a home in a modern style was no longer the exclusive preserve of the wealthy. MFI tapped into a deep vein of aspiration among the British working and emerging middle classes. A new kitchen became a tangible reality rather than an unattainable luxury. The genius of the flat-pack model was in its ruthless efficiency. It dramatically reduced manufacturing, storage, and shipping costs. There was no need to transport vast quantities of empty air inside hollow wardrobes. A delivery lorry could pack dozens of flat boxes into the space required for a mere handful of assembled units. These massive logistical savings were passed directly on to the consumer, creating a disruptive price point that traditional retailers simply could not touch. Inside British homes, the arrival of an MFI package became an event. Families would gather in the living room, spreading out the wooden panels, the bags of wooden dowels, and the notoriously cryptic instruction sheets. There was a unique sense of pride, a sweat equity, invested in these pieces. When the final screw was turned and the wardrobe stood upright, it wasn't just a piece of cheap furniture, it was something they had built themselves. However, as the 1960s progressed into the 1970s, the sheer, staggering volume of mail-order requests began to expose the limitations of relying solely on the postal service and newspaper adverts. Customers loved the prices, but they were becoming increasingly impatient with mail-order delivery times. Furthermore, many expressed a growing desire to physically see the furniture, to touch the veneer and open the drawers, before parting with their hard-earned wages. The mail-order model had conclusively proven that the British demand for affordable, self-assembly furniture was virtually insatiable. But to truly capitalize on this flat-pack revolution and dominate the market, Lister and Searle realized they needed to bring their products out of the Sunday supplements and directly to the people. They needed physical space to display fully built showrooms, vast amounts of it, space that simply did not exist on the cramped, traditional British high street. The stage was set for a monumental gamble that would permanently alter the geography of British retail. By the late 1970s and the dawn of the 1980s, the original mail-order model that had birthed Mullard Furniture Industries was bursting at the seams. The British public's appetite for affordable, self-assembly furniture was ravenous, but a fundamental logistical ceiling had been reached. Customers were growing weary of waiting weeks for postal deliveries, and more importantly, they wanted to physically see and touch the wardrobes and kitchen cabinets before handing over their hard-earned cash. The traditional British high street, however, offered no salvation. High street shops were narrow, rents were exorbitant, and parking was notoriously difficult. You could not reasonably expect a family to carry 3 heavy, 6-foot cardboard boxes containing a dismantled bedroom suite down a busy pavement and onto a local bus. MFI needed space, vast, cavernous, uninterrupted space, and they needed it to be accessible by car. The solution lay in a concept that was just beginning to take root in the United Kingdom, the out-of-town retail park. MFY became one of the earliest and most aggressive pioneers of the big box retail strategy. They moved away from the cramped town centres and began erecting massive, corrugated steel warehouses on the fringes of towns, alongside bypasses and industrial estates. These were colossal, unglamorous sheds, but they offered exactly what the business needed: thousands of square feet of showroom space, adjoining warehouses capable of holding immense inventory, and critically, acres of free car parks. This geographical shift fundamentally changed the way the British public shopped for furniture. The Saturday morning trip to MFY became a uniquely British suburban ritual. Families would pile into their Ford Cortinas or Vauxhall Cavaliers and drive out to the retail park. Looming over the tarmac were the giant, instantly recognizable blue and white MFE letters. Inside, the sheer scale of the operation was breathtaking. Customers would wander under harsh fluorescent lighting through dozens of meticulously staged room sets. There were endless rows of mock kitchens with plastic fruit in the bowls and bedroom displays featuring the latest in wood veneer finishes. It was an expedition. Parents would debate the merits of pine effect versus oak effect, while children invariably grew bored, dragging their feet across the hard showroom floors or hiding inside display wardrobes. Armed with a pencil, a tape measure, and a clipboard, couples would note down the complex alphanumeric codes of the items they wanted before heading to the sales desk to place their order and schedule a collection or delivery. MFI's expansion during the 1980s was not merely organic, it was ruthlessly acquisitive. To secure its dominance, the company realized it needed to own not just the showrooms, but the brands the public desired. In the early 1980s, MFI acquired Hygiena, a hugely respected name in fitted kitchens. A few years later, they absorbed Schreiber, a well-known furniture manufacturer. By bringing these heritage names under the MFI umbrella, the company achieved total vertical integration. They weren't just selling flat-pack bookcases anymore, they were selling the complete heart of the British home. This strategy coincided perfectly with the socio-economic shift of Margaret Thatcher's Britain. The Right to Buy scheme saw millions of council house tenants purchase their homes for the first time. This newly minted class of homeowners possessed a fierce desire to modernize, eager to rip out the dreary 1950s fixtures of their council properties and install gleaming, brand new Hygiena-fitted kitchens. MFI was perfectly positioned to capture this explosion in consumer spending. Throughout the late 1980s and into the 1990s, MFI was an unstoppable juggernaut. It was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the British retail park. At its absolute zenith, the company boasted a valuation in the billions of pounds. Its market penetration was so deep, and its presence so ubiquitous, that it was estimated 1 in every 3 British kitchens had been supplied by MFI. They had successfully transformed from a humble mail-order catalogue business into a high-volume, mass-market empire that dictated the aesthetic of the modern British home. The company seemed invincible, insulated by its sheer scale and the relentless churn of weekend footfall. However, the architecture of their success was hiding a fatal structural flaw. Operating massive warehouses filled with millions of individual, flat-packed components required a logistical precision that MFI's underlying systems simply did not possess. As the company scaled up to unprecedented heights, managing the dizzying array of wooden panels, specific hinges, correct screws, and delicate glass doors became perilously complex. The focus at board level remained obsessively fixed on rapid expansion, volume sales, and dominating retail park acreage. But down on the warehouse floors and at the customer service desks, a quiet chaos was beginning to take root. The empire had grown too large, too fast, and the very model that had made them billions, putting the furniture in boxes for the customer to build, was about to become the source of a national joke and their ultimate undoing. To the casual observer standing in the cavernous, brightly lit showrooms of an MFI retail park in the 1990s, the business appeared to be a flawless money-making machine. The tills rang constantly, the car parks were perpetually full, and the company's financial reports painted a picture of unassailable market dominance. Yet, beneath this veneer of corporate triumph, a deeply toxic relationship was developing between the brand and the British public. The sheer, unprecedented volume of furniture moving through MFI's supply chain was beginning to expose the fatal limitations of their quality control. The grand promise of the flat-pack revolution, affordable, stylish furniture for everyone, was rapidly souring in the living rooms and kitchens of Middle England. The journey of an MFI customer often began with genuine excitement. Having navigated the weekend crowds and successfully wrestled several heavy, awkward cardboard boxes into the boot of their Ford Mondeo, they would return home eager to transform their living space. The Saturday afternoon would be cleared, the tools laid out on the carpet, and the famously cryptic instruction manuals unfolded. But all too often, this anticipation would abruptly curdle into immense frustration. As families diligently followed the diagrams, turning chipboard panels and lining up wooden dowels, a depressing reality would dawn. A crucial bag of screws would be absent. A bespoke metal hinge would be bent out of shape. A wardrobe door, supposedly featuring a pristine wood effect finish, would emerge from its packaging with a deeply chipped corner. Sometimes it was an entire panel missing, rendering the half-built structure completely useless, a wooden skeleton occupying the bedroom floor. What happened next was an exercise in uniquely British retail misery. There was no quick fix. The customer was forced to abandon their weekend project, return to the retail park, and join the notoriously long and miserable queues at the MFI customer service desk. These desks, often tucked away in the gloomy corners of the massive sheds, became theatres of frustration. Weary shop assistants bore the brunt of the public's anger, tasked with navigating a rigid, archaic ordering system to request replacement parts. Crucially, because MFI's supply chain was geared entirely towards shipping full units from factories rather than managing spare components, getting a replacement hinge or a single door panel was a logistical nightmare. Customers were routinely told they would have to wait weeks, sometimes even months, for the missing piece to arrive. Kitchen renovations stalled entirely, leaving families cooking on camping stoves while waiting for a missing worktop bracket. Wardrobes stood doorless. Chests of drawers remained hollow shells. The basic transactional trust between the retailer and the buyer was not just broken, it was repeatedly and systematically shattered. It was during this period that a devastating shift occurred in the national consciousness. The British public, renowned for their dark sense of humour in the face of adversity, weaponized the company's own name against it. In pubs, workplaces, and across garden fences up and down the country, MFI was universally rechristened with a damaging moniker: missing, faulty, incomplete. It wasn't just a mild joke, it became an accepted cultural truth. Comedians on national television programs used MFI as an easy punchline for unreliability. If you bought from MFI, the conventional wisdom dictated you did so fully, expecting a weekend of arguments and a half-finished piece of furniture. The brand had inadvertently become synonymous with profound aggravation. Remarkably, the reaction from the MFI boardroom was characterized by a dangerous, terminal arrogance. The executives sitting in their comfortable headquarters were entirely insulated from the weekend misery unfolding in their shops. They looked at their spreadsheets, saw the billions in revenue and the massive market share, and concluded that the complaints were merely an acceptable margin of error in a high-volume business. They believed that because they were the cheapest, and because they were ubiquitous across every major retail park in the country, the British public had nowhere else to go. They assumed the consumer would simply swallow the poor service because the price was right. But this assumption was a catastrophic miscalculation. The Britain of the mid to late 1990s was changing. The economy was strengthening. Consumer credit was expanding, and the public's expectations were maturing. The working and middle classes no longer just wanted cheap. They wanted value. They wanted quality. And most importantly, they wanted their time respected. The tolerance for spending a Saturday arguing with a customer service assistant over a missing bag of wooden dowels was rapidly evaporating. MFI had fundamentally forgotten that retail is not just about moving boxes, it is about delivering on a promise. By allowing the missing, faulty, incomplete stigma to take root and fester, they had effectively hollowed out their own brand equity. They had alienated a generation of shoppers who silently vowed that once they could afford something better, they would never step foot inside an MFI again. The foundations of the empire were entirely compromised, rotting from the inside out. All it would take was a genuine alternative to arrive on British shores, and the entire structure would be pushed to the brink of collapse. While the executives at MFI's headquarters were busy counting their billions and brushing off the growing chorus of consumer complaints as a minor operational nuisance, a new, existential threat had quietly landed on British shores. The vulnerability created by the missing, faulty, incomplete stigma had left the door wide open, and an imposing, meticulously organized predator was ready to walk right through it. In October 1987, a massive, brightly coloured blue and yellow box opened its doors alongside the M62 motorway in Warrington, Cheshire. It was the United Kingdom's first introduction to the Swedish furniture behemoth, IKEA. Initially the established British retail giants, with MFI comfortably leading the pack, viewed this foreign arrival with a mixture of mild curiosity and smug dismissal. The prevailing attitude in the MFI boardroom was one of unshakable confidence. They believed they understood the British working and middle classes better than anyone. They assumed that the British consumer was inherently loyal to familiar domestic brands and would find the eccentric, maze-like Swedish store an irritating novelty. This assumption would prove to be one of the most devastating miscalculations in British retail history. IKEA did not simply arrive to compete on price, it arrived to entirely rewrite the rules of furniture shopping. Up until this point, a Saturday trip to an MFI retail park was widely regarded as a chore. It was a utilitarian, often stressful transaction involving uninspired, dimly lit showrooms, aggressive sales staff working on commission, and the dreary task of navigating complex order forms with a tiny pencil and a clipboard. IKEA, by stark contrast, transformed the purchase of a bookcase or a sofa into a highly engineered, immersive family day out. They introduced a retail psychology that the British high street and out-of-town retail parks had never seen before. From the moment a family parked their car, the experience was curated. There was Smoland, the supervised children's play area, filled with colourful plastic balls, which instantly removed the stress of dragging bored toddlers around a furniture showroom. Then there was the showroom itself. Instead of the sterile, disjointed mock-ups found in MFI, IKEA presented aspirational, fully realised apartments. Customers followed a strict, one-way system marked by arrows on the floor, forcing them to journey through every single department. It was a masterclass in visual merchandising, designed not just to sell a specific wardrobe, but to sell a complete Scandinavian lifestyle. Crucially, IKEA introduced a deeply clever innovation that kept shoppers inside the building for hours. The in-store restaurant. By offering heavily subsidized plates of Swedish meatballs, chips, and cheap cups of tea, they ensured that families did not have to leave the premises when they grew hungry and tired. A fed customer was a happy customer, and a happy customer was far more likely to linger in the marketplace section, impulsively tossing scented candles, cheap glassware, and potted plants into their large yellow bags. However, the most devastating blow to MFE's dominance was not the meatballs or the ball pit. It was the revolutionary concept of immediate gratification. At MFI, the standard practice was to order your furniture, pay at the tills, and then return home to wait. You waited for the factory to process the order, you waited for the delivery lorry, and all too often, you waited weeks for the inevitable missing parts to finally arrive in the post. IKEA completely inverted this model. After navigating the showroom, customers descended into the cavernous, self-serve warehouse. Armed with a trolley, they located the exact aisle and bin number of their chosen item, physically heaved the flat-pack boxes onto their trolley, paid at the tills, and drove it home that very same afternoon. There was no 6-week wait. There was no complex supply chain delay. You saw it, you bought it, you built it that evening. For a British public exhausted by the chronic unreliability of MFI, this instantaneous, streamlined efficiency was nothing short of a revelation. The Swedish invasion had begun, and the British retail landscape would never be the same again. The contrast between the two retail models could not have been more stark, and the British public voted with their feet. The car parks outside MFI's massive corrugated sheds, once packed to capacity every Saturday and Sunday, began to thin out. Meanwhile, traffic jams on the M62 and the North Circular became legendary, as shoppers queued for hours simply to get into an IKEA car park. It wasn't just the logistical superiority of taking your furniture home on the same day that was crippling MFI. It was a fundamental shift in aesthetic taste. For decades, MFI had defined the look of the British home, leaning heavily into dark wood veneers, fussy brass handles, and traditional slightly heavy designs that appealed to an older, post-war demographic. They sold furniture that looked sensible. But a new generation of homeowners, young professionals and couples buying their first flats in the late 1990s and early 2000s, wanted something entirely different. They had travelled more, they were influenced by changing media landscapes, and they craved modernity. IKEA delivered a light, airy, minimalist Scandinavian aesthetic that felt incredibly fresh. The pale birch woods, The bright primary colors of the textiles and the sleek, handleless kitchen cabinets made MFI's showrooms look instantly dated, like a relic from a bygone decade. Crucially, IKEA captured the youth market. MFI suddenly found itself suffering from the most dangerous affliction a retail brand can face. It became uncool. It became the place where your parents bought their dining table, not the place where you wanted to furnish your modern life. The long-standing joke of missing, faulty, incomplete stung infinitely more when there was a vibrant, efficient, and fashionable alternative just down the motorway. The MFI boardroom, previously insulated by their dominant market share, finally woke up to the smell of burning revenue. Panic began to set in. They watched helplessly as their grip on the British furniture market, a grip they had maintained for nearly 3 decades, started to slip. They attempted to fight back by introducing new, more modern product lines and attempting to tidy up their gloomy showrooms, but it was akin to putting a sticking plaster over a gaping wound. The core issue was not just the styling of the wardrobes, it was the broken, archaic infrastructure sitting behind them. To truly compete with the frictionless efficiency of their new European rivals, the executives realized that cosmetic changes would not be enough. They needed to entirely rip out and replace the very nervous system of the company, their supply chain and their aging IT infrastructure. They needed a system that could accurately track a single hinge from a factory in Asia right through to a customer's shopping trolley in a retail park in Birmingham. It was a bold, necessary, and highly ambitious plan. The board signed off on a massive, multi-million-pound technological overhaul, believing it would be the silver bullet to cure their logistical woes and restore their reputation. But instead of saving the company, this desperate roll of the dice would trigger a catastrophic chain reaction. They were about to unleash one of the most disastrous corporate IT failures in British retail history, a blunder so severe it would bring the entire empire to its knees. By the early 2000s, the writing was firmly on the wall for MFI. The boardroom, once a place of quiet confidence and unshakable belief in their retail park dominance, had become an environment of mounting panic. The Swedish invasion led by IKEA, combined with an increasingly sophisticated British consumer who no longer tolerated the infamous missing, faulty, incomplete standard of service, meant that MFI was hemorrhaging market share. Their aging business model, reliant on dim showrooms, aggressive sales tactics, and a clunky, paper-based ordering system, was completely incompatible with the new millennium. The executive team understood that cosmetic changes would no longer suffice. Repainting the massive corrugated sheds or introducing slightly lighter wood veneers was not going to save the empire. The fundamental rot lay deep within the company's internal infrastructure. Their supply chain, the invisible network responsible for moving millions of wooden panels, glass doors, and tiny bags of screws from global factories into the homes of the British public, was archaic. It was a fragmented, deeply inefficient system, heavily reliant on manual data entry, telephone calls, and clipboards. To compete with the frictionless, instantaneous gratification of modern retail, MFI needed to radically overhaul its central nervous system. In 2004, the board signed off on a monumental £50 million investment to implement a state-of-the-art IT and supply chain management system. This was supposed to be the company's grand salvation. The new software, developed in conjunction with major tech consultants, was designed to track every single item with pinpoint accuracy, streamline home deliveries, and finally eradicate the crippling issue of missing components. It was billed as the program that would drag MFI, kicking and screaming, into the 21st century. However, the rollout of this massive digital transformation was rushed. The pressure from falling sales figures and impatient shareholders created an environment where corners were inevitably cut. The testing phase was critically inadequate for a system of such staggering complexity. When MFY boldly flipped the switch to migrate their entire national operation onto the new software in the summer of 2004, they did not experience a minor teething problem. They triggered an absolute, unmitigated catastrophe. Almost overnight, the multi-million-pound system suffered a catastrophic collapse. The software, unable to handle the sheer volume and complexity of MFI's sprawling inventory, simply broke down. The consequences were immediate, visible, and devastating for the British consumer. Orders placed by customers seemingly vanished into a digital black hole. Lorries were dispatched from regional distribution centres entirely empty or loaded with the wrong furniture, arriving at the homes of bewildered customers. Conversely, warehouses became dangerously bottlenecked, overflowing with stock that the system refused to process for delivery. The chaos on the ground was unprecedented. Families who had ripped out their old kitchens in anticipation of an MFI delivery were left with bare walls and exposed pipes, surviving on microwave meals as they waited for units that never arrived. When deliveries did occasionally turn up, they were comically disastrous. Customers reported receiving entire fitted kitchens without a single door, or massive wardrobes accompanied by the wrong-sized hinges and completely incompatible instruction manuals. The long-standing joke of missing, faulty, incomplete was no longer just a witty pub observation. It was now happening on a terrifying industrial scale. The new £50 million system, designed specifically to cure the company's logistical illnesses, had instead unleashed a fatal virus into its bloodstream. On the shop floor, across the sprawling out-of-town retail parks, the situation was rapidly descending into open hostility. The frontline staff, many of whom had worked for MFI for years and were deeply embedded in their local communities, found themselves bearing the brunt of an unprecedented public relations catastrophe. They were left entirely blind by the new software, unable to tell furious customers where their £3,000 fitted kitchens were or when the missing doors might finally arrive. Store managers were reduced to handing out manual refunds, hurriedly writing physical checks from the back office because the digital network was too compromised to process basic transactions. The customer service telephone lines, completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of complaints, essentially melted down. Customers reported waiting on hold for hours, only to be cut off or told by distressed operators that their orders had simply been erased from the system. The national press, always eager for a high-profile corporate stumble, seized upon the chaos. Newspapers ran deeply damaging stories featuring photographs of frustrated families standing in half-finished, gutted kitchens, holding MFI responsible for ruining their homes and, in some highly publicized cases, their Christmases. The financial reverberations of the IT collapse were instantaneous and brutal. In a matter of months, MFI was forced to issue a series of devastating profit warnings to the City of London. The £50 million software system, rather than delivering the promised efficiencies, wiped out an estimated £30 million in profits almost immediately through lost sales, massive refund payouts, and emergency logistical workarounds. Lorries were being chartered at exorbitant emergency rates just to clear the massive bottlenecks in the warehouses, while millions of pounds of inventory sat unaccounted for, gathering dust. By the end of 2004, the damage to the MFI brand was no longer just reputational, it was structural and ultimately fatal. The public had lost any remaining shred of patience. Why would a family risk thousands of pounds and months of profound stress with MFI when they could simply drive down the motorway to IKEA and bring their furniture home on the same day? The missing, faulty, incomplete moniker was now permanently welded to the company's identity, elevated from a pub joke to a documented nationwide reality. The boardroom, which had gambled the company's future on this digital transformation, was in a state of paralysis. They had inadvertently destroyed their own supply chain, and in doing so, they had alienated their customer base beyond the point of reconciliation. As 2005 dragged on, the wider MFI Furniture Group, which also included a manufacturing arm, realized that the retail division was hemorrhaging cash at a terrifying, unsustainable rate. The massive, cavernous sheds on the retail parks, once the engines of their billion-pound valuation, had become gaping financial black holes, drained by plummeting footfall and exorbitant lease agreements. The executives were entirely out of ideas. The empire had grown too large, the structural rot was too deep, and the core consumer trust was entirely broken. MFI Retail was in a terminal nosedive, and the board recognized that to save the wider group, a brutal amputation was the only remaining option. They needed to offload the retail business, and they needed to do it immediately, regardless of the humiliation or the cost. The stage was set for one of the most undignified corporate fire sales in modern British history. The catastrophic failure of the £50 million IT rollout in 2004 did not merely damage MFI, it mortally wounded it. As the dust settled and the sheer scale of the financial devastation became apparent, the atmosphere within the boardroom shifted from panic to a cold, grim realization. The retail division was no longer a viable business. It was a rapidly expanding black hole, dragging the entire MFI furniture group towards complete insolvency. To understand the desperation of the situation, one must look at the wider corporate structure. The parent company did not just own the MFI retail stores, it also owned Howden's Joinery, a highly successful trade-only supplier of kitchens and joinery products. While MFE Retail was making headlines for missing doors, furious customers, and multi-million-pound losses, Howden's was quietly, efficiently, turning over a massive profit. By 2005, a deeply unsustainable dynamic had taken hold. The profitable, well-run Howden's division was effectively subsidizing the catastrophic losses of the MFI showrooms. For the executives and shareholders in the City of London, the arithmetic was brutally simple. If they did not amputate the rotting retail arm, the infection would spread and destroy the healthy trade business as well. The decision was made. MFI Retail had to be sold, regardless of the cost, the optics, or the humiliation. But finding a buyer for a business in such profound distress was a near impossible task. When potential investors opened the books, they recoiled in horror. They did not see a beloved British high street institution. They saw a toxic brand permanently scarred by the missing, faulty, incomplete stigma. They saw a shattered supply chain, a deeply demoralized workforce, and a customer base that had defected en masse to IKEA and other, more agile competitors. Most terrifying of all, however, were the leases. During the aggressive expansion of the 1980s and 1990s, MFI had signed long-term, highly expensive lease agreements on massive, cavernous, out-of-town retail park units. Back when the car parks were full and the tills were constantly ringing, these exorbitant rents were simply the cost of doing business. But now, with footfall plummeting and the showrooms resembling ghost towns, these leases had become financial millstones. Whoever bought MFI would not just be buying cheap wardrobes. They would be legally bound to pay tens of millions of pounds a year for massive, empty sheds. Unsurprisingly, traditional retail competitors wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. The only entities willing to touch a business in this state were private equity firms, specialists in distressed assets, turnaround strategies, and ruthless financial engineering. In September 2006, the inevitable occurred. It was announced that Merchant Equity Partners, a private equity group, had agreed to buy the MFI retail network. The headline figure sent shockwaves through the British retail industry and the national press. An empire that had once been valued in the billions, a brand that had furnished a third of all British kitchens, was sold for a single, solitary £1 coin. To the general public, it sounded like a joke, the ultimate punchline to the MFI story, a household name traded for less than the price of a cup of tea. But in the ruthless world of corporate finance, that £1 coin represented something far more complex and terrifying. Merchant Equity Partners wasn't just handing over a pound, they were taking on the monumental burden of the company's colossal debt, its broken supply chain, and crucially, the crushing liabilities of those out-of-town retail park leases. The parent company was so desperate to be rid of the retail division that they actually agreed to pay the new owners millions of pounds just to take it off their hands, effectively subsidizing the divorce so they could focus entirely on saving Howden's. MFI had gone from being the undisputed king of the retail park to a distressed liability that its owners had to pay to give away. When Merchant Equity Partners officially assumed control of MFY Retail in the autumn of 2006, they inherited a business that was entirely devoid of momentum, goodwill, and cash. The private equity playbook for distressed retail assets is traditionally clinical and unsentimental, and the strategy applied to MF was no exception. The new owners immediately embarked on a savage program of restructuring and cost-cutting in a desperate bid to stem the millions of pounds hemorrhaging from the company's accounts every month. The first casualty of this aggressive turnaround strategy was the workforce. Thousands of redundancies were announced across the supply chain, at the head office and on the shop floors. The remaining staff, already deeply traumatized by the chaotic fallout of the 2004 IT disaster and exhausted by years of facing furious customers, were now subjected to a culture of extreme corporate austerity. The soul of the company, the camaraderie of the shop floor, and the pride of the local delivery drivers was systematically stripped away, replaced by the cold, hard metrics of survival. In the cavernous showrooms on the out-of-town retail parks, the atmosphere became noticeably bleak. In an attempt to improve cash flow, the new management ruthlessly squeezed their suppliers, demanding extended payment terms and slashing wholesale prices. In response, the quality of the goods, already the subject of national ridicule, deteriorated even further. The once bustling display areas began to look sparse and unloved. To the British public, walking into an MFI in 2007 felt like walking into a corporate ghost ship. The bright, aspirational displays of the 1980s were long gone, replaced by peeling veneer, flickering fluorescent lights, and an overwhelming sense of managed decline. However, the most insurmountable obstacle facing merchant equity partners was not the poor quality of the wardrobes or the sheer dominance of IKEA, it was the inescapable, suffocating burden of the property portfolio. During MFY's golden era, in the late 1980s and 1990s, the company's executives had aggressively expanded their footprint, signing 20-year and 25-year leases on colossal retail park units across the country. Crucially, these leases were negotiated under the standard British commercial property terms of the era, featuring upward-only rent reviews. This meant that regardless of whether the company was making £1 billion in profit or losing millions, the rent on those massive corrugated sheds would only ever increase. For a business operating on wafer-thin margins with plummeting footfall, these leases were a financial death sentence. MFY was legally bound to pay millions of pounds a year for acres of showroom space that they could no longer fill in retail parks that the British public no longer wanted to visit. They were trapped in a geographical and financial prison entirely of their own making. The private equity owners attempted to sublet sections of these massive units to other retailers, frantically trying to chop up the vast, empty spaces to generate any form of income. But it was a futile exercise. The retail landscape was changing rapidly. The era of the massive, single-brand furniture shed was coming to an end, and nobody wanted to take on the toxic burden of MFI's unwanted square footage. By early 2008, MFI had become a zombie company. It was technically still trading, the doors were open, and the blue and white signs still loomed over the car parks, but the entity was effectively dead. It was surviving purely on financial engineering, life support, and desperate short-term cash injections. The grand vision of Noel Lister and Donald Searle, the mail-order pioneers who had democratized British interior design, had been reduced to a grim, spreadsheet-driven exercise in damage limitation. They had slashed the workforce, they had gutted the supply chain, and they had alienated their final remaining customers. The private equity owners had squeezed every conceivable drop of fat from the carcass of the business. MFY was standing precariously on the absolute edge of the precipice, entirely stripped of its defenses. All it would take was a single external shock to tip the entire, crumbling edifice into the abyss. And as the spring of 2008 turned to summer, that shock was rapidly gathering on the global financial horizon. As the calendar turned to 2008, the executives at Merchant Equity Partners were still frantically attempting to bail water from the sinking ship that was MFI. They had slashed the workforce, squeezed the supply chain until it broke, and desperately tried to renegotiate the crushing leases on their out-of-town retail park sheds. But while they were fighting a desperate internal war, an external storm of unimaginable ferocity was gathering on the global horizon. The British economy was beginning to buckle under the early tremors of the global financial crisis. The era of cheap, easily accessible credit, the very fuel that had powered the British retail boom for the past decade, was coming to a violent end. For the average consumer, the immediate reality was a sudden, terrifying freeze in the housing market. Banks stopped lending, mortgage approvals plummeted to record lows, and the previously unstoppable upward trajectory of British property prices slammed into a brick wall. For MFI, this macroeconomic shift was nothing short of an apocalyptic event. The furniture and fitted kitchen market is inextricably linked to the housing market. People traditionally buy a new £3,000 kitchen or a complete bedroom suite when they move into a new property, or when they remortgage to fund extensive home improvements. When the property ladder stops moving, the tills in furniture showrooms fall completely silent. Families, suddenly anxious about their jobs and their plunging house equity, firmly shut their wallets. The weekend ritual of wandering around an MFI on a retail park to plan a new kitchen was replaced by a grim national financial anxiety. Almost overnight, the already dwindling footfall in MFY's massive corrugated sheds evaporated entirely. The vast car parks, built to accommodate thousands of weekend shoppers, lay virtually empty, haunted only by the cars of the deeply worried staff. But the fatal blow, the absolute death knell for MFI, came from a largely invisible sector of the financial industry, the credit insurers. In the retail industry, credit insurance is the silent engine that keeps the entire supply chain moving. It allows retailers to order millions of pounds worth of goods from suppliers and pay for them 30, 60, or 90 days later, knowing that an insurance company will cover the supplier if the retailer goes bust. In the late summer of 2008, as panic gripped the financial markets and MFI's sales figures went into freefall, the credit insurers took one look at the company's books and pulled the plug. They entirely withdrew their cover. This was the equivalent of cutting the oxygen supply to a patient already on life support. Without credit insurance, the global network of suppliers manufacturing MFI's wooden panels, hinges and appliances simply refused to dispatch any more goods unless they were paid entirely in cash, up front. MFI, heavily indebted and bleeding millions, simply did not have the cash to meet these demands. The supply chain, already notoriously fragile and damaged by the 2004 ET disaster, ground to a complete and permanent halt. The consequences on the shop floor were immediate and deeply distressing. The sprawling showrooms, designed to look aspirational and fully stocked, began to resemble looted warehouses. Display units were sold off piecemeal just to generate a trickle of revenue. When the few remaining customers tried to order a wardrobe or a kitchen, the frontline staff were forced to look at their screens and admit that they had absolutely no idea when or even if the stock would arrive. The public quickly realized what was happening. Rumors of MFW's imminent collapse spread like wildfire across the high streets and retail parks. A devastating psychological tipping point was reached. Nobody wants to hand over a £1,000 deposit to a retailer that might not exist next week. Customer confidence, which had been steadily eroding for years thanks to the missing, faulty, incomplete reputation, finally flatlined completely. Those who had already placed orders began turning up at the retail parks, angrily demanding their deposits back, further draining the company's microscopic cash reserves. Behind closed doors, the situation was utterly hopeless. Merchant equity partners, having realized the £1 acquisition was a toxic chalice they could not cleanse, effectively threw their hands in the air. In September 2008, in a final, desperate act of corporate musical chairs, they sold MFI via a management buyout to a small group of directors for a small nominal sum. It was a meaningless transaction, shifting the deck chairs on the Titanic long after the ship had slipped beneath the waves. The management team took control of a business with no money, no stock, no supplier goodwill, and thousands of terrified employees. As the bitter chill of November approached, it became painfully clear that MFY would not survive to see another Christmas. The giant blue and white letters that had dominated the British retail landscape for 4 decades were about to be unceremoniously torn down. The empire was finally ready to collapse. On Wednesday, the 26th of November 2008, the prolonged, agonizing death rattle of MFY finally came to an end. After months of desperate financial engineering, catastrophic supply chain failures, and a devastating loss of consumer trust, the company officially collapsed into administration. Meansy's corporate restructuring was formally appointed to take control of the wreckage. For a brand that had spent over 4 decades acting as the undisputed heavyweight of the British retail park, the end was brutally swift and entirely devoid of dignity. The immediate reality of administration is rarely a calm, managed transition. It is a sudden, violent severing of the corporate nervous system. On that cold November morning, across the remaining estate of over 110 massive out-of-town sheds, the tills were abruptly locked. The internal computer networks were shut down. The massive, brightly lit showrooms, which had once defined the aesthetic of the modern British home, were plunged into an eerie, unnatural silence. The human cost of the collapse was immediate and profound. MFY, even in its diminished state, still employed thousands of people across its shop floors, warehouses, and head offices. Store managers were summoned to emergency conference calls, only to be told the stark, unvarnished truth by the administrators. The business was entirely out of cash. There was no rescue package, no white knight investor waiting in the wings, and absolutely no guarantee that the staff would receive their next pay packet. The timing could not have been more deeply cruel. It was late November, the festive season was rapidly approaching, and retail staff up and down the country were usually preparing for the busiest, most profitable period of the year. Instead, thousands of MFI employees were unceremoniously handed redundancy notices. Men and women who had dedicated years, sometimes decades, to the company were told to gather their personal belongings, lock the doors of their showrooms, and go home to face a Christmas entirely devoid of financial security. But the tragedy was not confined to the workforce. As the news of the administration broke across national television and radio bulletins, a wave of sheer panic swept through MFY's customer base. Tens of thousands of British families suddenly realized that the business holding their hard-earned money had just ceased to exist. These were not trivial purchases. Customers had handed over substantial deposits, often running into thousands of pounds, for complete fitted kitchens and complex bedroom suites that they were relying on to finish major home renovations. Upon hearing the news, furious and terrified customers descended upon the out-of-town retail parks, desperately seeking answers. What they found were locked glass doors, darkened showrooms, and hastily printed A4 notices taped to the windows by the administrators, bearing the grim, legalistic language of corporate insolvency. There were no shop assistants available to shout at, no customer service desk to queue behind. The company had essentially vanished overnight, taking their deposits with it. The scenes outside the shuttered MFI units were unprecedented in British retail history. Crowds of bewildered, angry people gathered in the freezing car parks. Some banged their fists against the glass. Others tried to force open the loading bay doors at the rear of the warehouses, desperately hoping to physically locate the kitchen units they had already paid for. Police had to be called to several locations to maintain order, as the realization set in that, as unsecured creditors, these families were at the absolute bottom of the pile, highly unlikely to ever see their furniture or a single penny of their money again. The administrators, Menzies' corporate restructuring, faced an impossible, thankless task. They had inherited a sprawling retail network with a paralyzed supply chain, a catastrophic public image, and a massive black hole where the operational cash should have been. In the immediate aftermath of the collapse, they frantically attempted to find a buyer for the remaining 111 stores, holding on to a faint hope that a rival retailer might want to acquire the property footprint, if not the toxic MFI brand itself. But in the freezing, credit-starved winter of 2008, absolutely no one was buying. The British High Street and its retail parks were already beginning to litter with the casualties of the financial crisis, most notably the devastating concurrent collapse of Woolworths. There was zero appetite for taking on dozens of expensive long-term leases for cavernous empty sheds. With no white knight forthcoming, the administrators had no choice but to initiate the final, deeply humiliating phase of MFY's existence, the liquidation sale. For a brief, chaotic window in December 2008, a selection of the out-of-town units were forced back open, not to take new orders or rebuild trust, but to aggressively liquidate whatever physical stock happened to be left in the warehouses and on the shop floors. The scenes inside these closing down sales were a grim, depressing parody of the brand's former glory. Massive, garish yellow and red banners screaming, "Everything must go," and "Administration sale" were hastily draped across the familiar blue and white facades. Inside, the carefully staged mock kitchens and aspirational bedroom displays were brutally dismantled and sold off piece by piece. Customers scavenged through cardboard bins of heavily discounted, disjointed hardware. Display units, often visibly scratched, missing their hinges, or entirely lacking instructions, were dragged across the car parks for pennies on the pound. Even the shop fittings, the shelving, the desks, the warehouse racking, were given a price tag. The atmosphere was vulture-like, completely stripped of any remaining dignity. For the skeletal crew of staff tasked with managing this final liquidation, it was an agonizing, traumatic ordeal. They were forced to stand behind the tills, wearing their MFI fleeces for the last time, effectively processing the remnants of their own livelihoods. Every day they had to endure the constant, often aggressive barrage of questions from previously loyal customers demanding answers about their lost thousands in deposits, money that the frontline staff knew the administrators would likely never refund. They worked their final, exhausting shifts under the darkest of clouds, acutely aware that a bleak, unemployed Christmas awaited them the moment the last scratched wardrobe was wheeled out the door. By the week before Christmas, even the carcass had been picked clean. There was nothing left to sell. The administrators finally called time. The last tills were switched off. The harsh fluorescent showroom lights were permanently extinguished. The heavy metal shutters were pulled down over the loading bays, the padlocks snapping shut for the very last time. The giant, illuminated MFI letters that had served as unmistakable beacons on British retail parks since the 1980s were left to gather grime in the winter rain, standing as colossal, silent tombstones for a fallen empire. The collapse of MFY retail was absolute. Thousands of loyal staff lost their jobs in those final, brutal weeks of 2008, joining the swelling ranks of the unemployed during the worst economic downturn in modern British history. The brand that had democratized interior design, that had furnished millions of first homes, and that had entirely dictated the out-of-town weekend shopping routine of the British public, had been comprehensively erased from the physical retail landscape. It was a staggering, sobering demise, an empire that suffocated under the weight of its own operational arrogance, a catastrophic technological failure, and a fatal, irreversible disconnect from the very families who had built it. The physical legacy of MFY's sudden and absolute collapse was impossible for the British public to ignore. In the bleak economic winter of early 2009, the out-of-town retail parks, once the bustling engines of the national consumer economy, were suddenly scarred by colossal, empty voids. The massive corrugated sheds that had previously housed the MFI empire stood completely dormant, their car parks chained off and gathering weeds. Faded, rectangular outlines remained clearly visible on the metal cladding, a ghostly imprint of the giant blue and white letters that had been hastily unbolted by the administrators. These massive, empty units presented a profound headache for commercial landlords across the United Kingdom. The retail landscape was undergoing a seismic, irreversible shift. The era of the mammoth, single-brand furniture showroom, which MFI had so aggressively championed in the 1980s and 1990s, was effectively over. A new, far more cautious economic reality had taken hold. No single retailer was willing to take on the toxic burden of such vast, cavernous square footage or the exorbitant, upward-only lease agreements that had ultimately strangled MFI. To solve this spatial crisis, the retail parks had to fundamentally reinvent themselves. The monolithic MFI sheds were systematically carved up. Landlords erected internal dividing walls, splitting the giant warehouses into 2, 3, or sometimes 4 smaller, more manageable units. Into this newly divided space stepped the vanguard of the post-2008 high street, the aggressive discount chains. Brands like B&M, Home Bargains, and Pound Stretcher eagerly snapped up these fragmented units capitalizing on a financially battered British public desperate for value. The very spaces where young couples had once agonized over the financing of a £4,000 fitted kitchen were now filled with aisles of discounted cleaning products, cheap seasonal goods, and multi-packs of crisps. The aspirational weekend shopping trip had been replaced by the necessity of the bargain hunt. Yet, in a deeply ironic twist of modern retail history, the MFI name refused to die completely. In 2011, the brand was resurrected from the ashes of administration by Victoria Plum, an online-only bathroom and bedroom retailer. They purchased the rights to the name for a mere fraction of its former billion-pound valuation. However, this was a hollow resurrection. The new iteration of MFE was nothing more than a URL on a screen. There were no physical showrooms, no cavernous warehouses on retail parks, no fleets of delivery lorries, and absolutely no connection to the tens of thousands of staff who had built the original empire. The brand name had been entirely severed from its physical history, utilized merely as a recognizable search engine term to drive internet traffic. To the generations of Britons who remembered the Saturday afternoon queues, the complex paper order forms, and the sheer scale of the retail park sheds, this digital ghost ship bore no resemblance to the giant they once knew. The ultimate tragedy of Mullard Furniture Industries is that its demise was not the inevitable result of a changing market, but rather a self-inflicted execution. Noel Lister and Donald Searle had built a fundamentally brilliant business, democratizing interior design and empowering the British public with the flat-pack revolution. But the corporation that inherited their vision fell victim to a terminal case of corporate hubris. They became mesmerized by their own market dominance, assuming that their sheer size rendered them immune to the consequences of chronic, systemic incompetence. They treated the British consumer with a toxic mixture of arrogance and apathy, allowing the missing, faulty, incomplete stigma to fatally rot their reputation from the inside out. When they finally attempted to modernize, the £50 million IT disaster proved that they had fundamentally lost control of the very logistics that had once made them billions. They had forgotten that retail is not merely the transaction of moving cardboard boxes. It is the delicate, fragile art of fulfilling a promise to the customer. Today, as shoppers wander through the brightly lit, meticulously organized one-way systems of an IKEA or effortlessly order bespoke, next-day furniture from their smartphones, the chaotic, frustrating memory of the MFI weekend trip feels like a relic from a distant, almost incomprehensible era. MFI taught the British retail industry a brutal, unforgettable lesson. No matter how many millions of homes you furnish, and no matter how thoroughly you dominate the retail park, the moment you take the public's patience for granted, your empire will be dismantled, piece by piece, and flat pack by flat pack. The story of MFY is perhaps one of the most frustrating chapters in modern British retail history. It stands as a stark, unforgiving reminder that no corporate empire, regardless of how thoroughly it dominates the out-of-town retail parks or how many millions of homes it furnishes, is ever truly invincible. The collapse of Mullard Furniture Industries was not the result of a single, unavoidable stroke of bad luck, nor was it merely a passive casualty of the 2008 financial crash. It was a slow, painful, and almost entirely self-inflicted demise. A beloved brand does not vanish overnight simply because a Swedish rival opens a large blue and yellow shop down the motorway. It vanishes when it fundamentally forgets the very people who built it. For a generation of British families, the Saturday morning trip to MFI, clipboard and tiny pencil in hand, debating the merits of oak veneers while navigating those cavernous, brightly lit sheds, was a quintessential part of creating a home. Retail, at its absolute heart, is never just about exchanging cash for flat-pack cardboard boxes. It is deeply emotional. It is about aspiration. It is the pride of a young couple buying their very first wardrobe, or a working-class family finally saving enough for a brand-new fitted kitchen. When MFY allowed the missing, faulty, incomplete stigma to take root and fester, and when they subjected their fiercely loyal frontline staff and exhausted customers to the unmitigated agony of a £50 million IT disaster, they didn't just lose revenue, they broke a fundamental pact of trust. The boardroom believed that their sheer, overwhelming scale would indefinitely protect them from the consequences of their own apathy. they were fatally mistaken. Today, as the giant blue and white letters fade from the national memory, replaced by discount chains operating out of subdivided retail park units, the ghost of MFI serves as a potent warning. Businesses survive through relentless adaptation and a profound respect for the consumer, but they die the moment they believe that their past successes will automatically guarantee their future survival. Thank you for joining us on this journey through a uniquely turbulent piece of British retail history. If you remember spending your weekend afternoons wandering the aisles of an MFI, or if you happen to still have an indestructible piece of their flat-pack furniture standing in your bedroom, we would love to hear your stories in the comments below. Please do leave a like, share this documentary, and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the vanished giants of the British High Street and beyond.